Good morning and a very warm welcome to this plenary session on how to overcome financing barriers to women's climate security actions and activities. We are hosted jointly by Kvinna, CIPRI and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Now the idea of this session is first of all to turn the spotlight on the really important work done by women's organizations, women's activists, who are working on addressing climate change, environmental disaster and human insecurities. They strive daily to influence decision-making on land, forest and water use, and they make great contributions to peace-building efforts. Yet they are, for different reasons, facing a host of barriers to financing. According to the OECD, as of 2018, only 3% of climate financing was directed at women or girls. So our discussion cannot stop at simply talking and highlighting the important work of women's organizations. We also have to get very practical and talk about financing barriers and how we can improve and overcome those barriers to make sure that those on the front lines of this really important work can really access the kind of financing necessary to do their work. My name is Robert Egnell, a professor of leadership at the Swedish Defence University and also the president there. I'm deeply honored and excited about the chance to moderate this panel because we truly have a star panel in front of you. And with that, I'll take a seat and introduce the gang to you. First, Olsson Fridh is the Director General of the Folke Bernadotte Academy, a Swedish government agency for peace, security and development who specialize in the most difficult parts of the world. Before joining the FBA, you were the Swedish Minister for International Development Cooperation, and as part of that, you oversaw the development cooperation components of the Swedish feminist foreign policy. Petra Tötterman Andorff is the Secretary General of Kvinna. Founded in 1993, this is one of the world's leading women's rights organizations who are working directly in conflict zones and areas affected by war to strengthen women's influence and power, violence against women, reach lasting peace and close the gender gap once and for all. And they do so by working very closely with 150 local partner organizations in over 20 countries. Balikungeri is a gender, peace and conflict resolution advocate with over 2 decades of experience in championing women's and girls' rights. The founder of the Rwanda Women's Network, an NGO dedicated to the promotion and improvement of socioeconomic welfare of women in Rwanda. But you're also currently the chair of the African Network for Women Shelters, working both at the local and the international level then. With us online is Dr. Oyun Sanjaasuren, who is the Director of External Relations in the Green Climate Fund. Not only does she have great experience working on funding within the Climate Fund and financing of peace building and climate-related activities, but she also, in her home country, has been a member of Parliament as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Environment. Finally, Elizabeth Spehar is the Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support within the UN. With 35 years of experience in international affairs, working in the UN at the headquarters level, but as much in the field. You've been working on political development, peace building and conflict prevention activities. In essence, I'd say you're the personification of integrated missions, comprehensive approaches, whole of government activities, or whatever concept we use to describe that. And not least, your prior positions include being the SRSG and the head of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus. So quite a dream team to address these important issues. Now, the last few days I've had the honor of participating online, so I can testify to the fact that this works just as well at home as it does here, but I have to say that I'm a little awestruck once I'm here in the physical world as well. But we will obviously continue this hybrid format, so there's an opportunity for you participating at home to ask questions, submit them through the chat function, and we will try and distribute questions evenly for you at home, but also for you here in the audience. Now, let's get started with a round of questions for our panelists. And Per, I would like to start with you. And if you could please provide a little context and a background to the topic of this panel. Why is it so important to support women's organizations that work on climate and environmental security? In essence, what is it that they do that make their work so important?
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic panel. I'm as starstruck as you are, I think, and it's also an opportunity, being just a couple of weeks into my new position, to be able to join conversations like this. It's a true privilege. Now, I mean, I think we need to start by saying, firstly, climate change is today our biggest threat to human security, and that is worldwide. And we've heard during the years, and it's still true, women are very often the first victims and the most vulnerable to the consequences of climate change, but also to armed conflict or to conflict in any other way. But not as often we hear that the same women who are the victims of the consequences of both war and climate change are the same women who holds the keys to the solutions to these issues. Very often resilience is built by women through informal networks or formal organizations. Very often the keys of mapping what is needed to sustain peace lies within the same networks. So there's huge potential in building and supporting and resourcing women's networks and women's organizations, both in peace building and in climate action. But we're not using this potential in either of the agendas. So as we meet at this conference to merge the agendas, to see the interlinkages and reinforcing streams between climate action and peace building, that potential is doubled, but still we're losing it. So to access, not only to provide financing, but to actually get women's organizations, networks to access that financing is key if we want to have any type of durable solutions, anything that could and will sustain.
So they're instrumental in both understanding the situation, the challenges at hand, but also in how to address these challenges.
Absolutely. And I mean, Sweden we stand firmly behind, of course, an FBA as an instrumental role in the feminist foreign policy. And it is concentrated around representation, yes, rights, of course, but also resources, because we need to get practical. We need to move from just talking about this to actually find the money and have access to that money in the field. And that requires, and I look forward to the discussion, but that requires a completely new ways of adapting financing modalities. But to be frank and honest, this is about power structures. By changing who is getting funding and how to access this, we are challenging power structures in all levels of our societies, and we need to do so.
Thank you very much. Petra, Kvinna till Kvinna is working with women's organizations all over the world.
Yes.
And I'm sure you would like to expand on the same question.
Yes.
But also, what is it that women's organizations and the work that they're doing with this field, how is that different, and how does that impact their access to funding?
Well, first I'd like to echo what Per said in so many points, and we know, and have for such a long time, know the consequences of the climate crisis to women, to women's lives, to women's rights. And I think to fully understand the complexity of the challenges that we see, we have women's rights organizations don't just work on the climate crisis. They work constantly in nexuses, which is also a concept that the international community has made up, because I'm pretty sure that women's rights organizations don't say, we're going to work on the nexus today. They work on the climate crisis and then combine it to gender-based violence or to participation or to women's economic rights. But as I said, the international community, we have our funding streams in these silos, and that is one challenge that doesn't match with the way, and it's not just women's rights organizations that work in this way. A lot of the youth organizations, indigenous rights organizations, they work on the context at hand, the problems that they see. So we know that, and in addition to that, in conflict-affected countries, the groups that are working on women's rights and other marginalized groups, they don't have the margins for the additional burden and vulnerability that comes with climate crisis. So it also, I think, sometimes it might be too overwhelming to think about the climate crisis as something that they should approach as well. So I think there are a lot of different things. And you mentioned that 3% of climate financing goes to women's rights organization. Well, if we look at the total ODA, we'd see that 4% of the bilateral aid has gender as a primary focus. That's 4%. 42 has it as a secondary target. And out of the focus on gender, only 1% goes to women's rights organizations. So that's basically nothing. So if we start there with the challenges of financing for women's rights organizations, let's start by increasing that number, because today, literally no money, almost no money goes to women's rights organizations. And we know that the UN Peacebuilding Fund has actually is stepping forward, showing way. They have allocated 40% of their funding to projects, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it reaches, organizations in the global south and the smaller women's rights organization. We can talk more about that, the unregistered groups, the networks, etc. And I think this, if I go back to where I started about this issue of nexus, I think that's also a topic that's underexplored, looking at the nexus of gender, conflict, and climate.
There's a risk we're talking about a razor-thin slice of a razor-thin slice of another slice when we're talking about funding these types of activities and women's organizations then. We'll get back to that, I'm sure. Mary, you are one of those organizations, you represent one of those organizations who are really working on the forefront of these issues on the ground in Rwanda. What are the main challenges you are facing, and what do you want to see happen and change in order for you to make sure that your work can be at your full potential?
Yeah, thank you very much. What do you want me to say? And what do you expect me to really say? I want to make sure is a key takeaway for everybody in this room. First of all, let me say thank you so much to Kvinna for having given me this opportunity to come and join this high-level forum. In my work in Rwanda, you all know the history of my country. We are battling with issues of community-based organizing. I come from an organization that is very, very community-based, and our work is very much focused on organizing, mobilizing, and working towards social transformation. So in working towards social transformation, it means that, of course, to be able to achieve our agenda, financing is key. And so when we are talking about climate issues, I want to address the climate issues away from the way you see it, but I want to put climate issues from everyday life of a woman in Rwanda, in Africa in general, because these are women who are dealing with the crisis every day. And in juggling with those issues, there are many, many areas that we really want to be able to address. First of all, we are looking at the challenging issues at the household level, where every woman struggles to put food at the table. But in putting food at the table, there are lots of challenges around it. This is a woman who is going to go to the field and is be able maybe to face issues of climate challenges, and at the same time, be able also to be part and parcel of the whole governance mechanism that we are talking about in the country. So my work clearly needs a lot more to look at how best we organize women so that women can also take leadership. And this requires definitely also the role of governments to be able to give us opportunities to engage, to also vie for political offices, and to also be able to challenge where we think things are not working well. And to be able to do that, financing is key. Yeah. And you talked earlier on of 3% of climate financing. And we hear of 1% gender financing. So you can imagine by the time it trickles where I am, it will have even become, I think, 0%. Because this is percentage that's shared among many of us from different layers. So when you talk about the challenges we see, we are also looking at what are the easiest and the best partnerships that we need to be talking about here, vying for partnerships that makes things work. And we find it easier maybe to work with women's organizations because it's easy to pick up the phone and say, you know what, I can't give you a report at a certain time. So that demands about flexibility and easy access to those. And to be able to do that, we are here really looking at partnerships that are trustworthy, right, and ready and willing to invest in us because you trust us. So what kind of process do we need to take in order to build that trustship relationship? Because I think that's where the key is. So for me, what I really would want to see is flexibility, partnerships that work for us, and also understanding that from where we are seated, we don't have the digital, we are not in a digital world where we do things quick, but we are looking also to be capacitated so that we can eventually be at par as our partners from the north. So looking at all this, we are really looking and vying to find relationships, partnerships that work to be able to strengthen our movements because we are working towards the constituency building, capacity building, institutionally strengthening ourselves so that the day Kvinna till Kvinna is not in Rwanda, Rwanda Women Network is able to take leadership. So that's what we are looking for, and that's, I think, the sustainability journey that we're asking for here. So I will stop here. Maybe we can, as we converse.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I find it so interesting that you're highlighting social organizing and capacity building to the extent that you are. And obviously, otherwise you risk ending up in a catch-22 because gaining access to these international funds is a complicated matter, obviously. And the reporting structures, you need really strong organizations and a lot of capacity and knowledge on how to do that. So we need to work on both ends at the same time, obviously.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Oyun, thank you so much for participating online. It's great to have you here. And also the fact that you've stepped in on almost a minute basis before this panel is really impressive. Your organization, the Green Climate Fund, is obviously at the heart of this topic. And you're very welcome to give your first little address on behalf of your boss as well.
Yes. No, it's of course indeed a privilege for GCF Green Climate Fund to be invited and be on this very important panel. And sincere apologies on behalf of our Executive Director, Yannick Limarek, who was supposed to be, and he was very much looking forward to his interventions because the topic of climate and women is actually very close to his heart. So first of all, I would like to actually deliver very brief remarks on his behalf because he was himself, writing and working on his remarks. So apologies, he couldn't join at the last moment. So let me just allow him on his behalf first. So fragile states have the most to lose from climate inaction, but the most to gain from ambitious global climate action. Climate positive investment can enhance the resilience to conflict. Climate positive investment can provide reliable energy access to diversify economic livelihoods. They can enhance resilience to extreme weather events and economic shocks, strengthen community engagement and social capital, and foster inclusive, peaceful, and sustainable development pathways. But at the same time, climate positive investment can face specific challenges in fragile states. For example, last year, GCF projects were brought to a halt in 2 countries that suffered a dramatic deterioration of peace and security. So how do we ensure financing reaches those at the front lines of climate security action in conflict-affected and fragile settings? First, climate investors must be patient and prepared to take risks. Many fragile countries have a low credit rating and find it difficult to attract investment. GCF has a higher risk management and tolerance capacity than many funders. We can take first loss positions and offer long-term concessional finance to demonstrate new climate solutions at commercial scale to crowd in other investors, of course, including private sector. Next, we need to invest in capacity building. In addition to de-risking investment, our fund is the largest source of grant assistance to establish strong institutions, supportive policies, and empower local actors to attract climate investment. Furthermore, of course, robust environmental, social, governance safeguards are essential. We do have a comprehensive environmental social management system. We mainstream, and we're proud that mainstreaming gender equality requirements throughout our entire project cycle is key for us, and we have developed an indigenous people policy to ensure the rights of groups who are often economically marginalized and vulnerable. An independent redress mechanism can be accessed by any community or individual fearing that their rights will be infringed by GCF-supported investment. And finally, of course, having clear metrics and indicators is essential to measure how climate finance impacts peace and security. We just recently adopted integrated results management framework, which includes 12 indicators, and then they do have certain indicators that will give very much progress in our way forward. Now, maybe I'll stop here and I'll bring some of the other points which also Yannick put together, and then also I'll bring my own perspective as well when we get to the more interactive discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Elizabeth, with your extensive experience working in international organizations, could you address the types of reforms that you think are needed from donors in order to address some of the issues that have been raised in the panel so far?
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's also for me a real privilege to be here in my, I think, third month into this particular position with the United Nations, and to be among such esteemed colleagues and friends here. I have to say also, I of course subscribe to everything I've heard so far. Some really good points have already been made, and I won't repeat them, but I did want to pick up on a couple of things that Mary said and also Oyun repeated. And within what they were saying, I wanted to pull out two words in particular, trust and risk-taking. Right. And I think we have to realize that if we're going to go to the real agents of change on the ground in order to have the positive effects that we need on climate change and in a peace-positive way, we're going to have to be able to work and support those small grassroots groups who are embedded in their communities, who are known and trusted as well. We need also to trust them. And that's where the risk-taking sometimes comes in, because, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this a bit more later, many of these small groups don't have the type of management structures, capacities for monitoring the initiatives or doing the report writing and so forth that many larger funders require, and therefore they're shut out of some important financing. So this is an issue that can have some remedies, but I think, again, in terms of risk-taking, we do need to be ready to take some risk. And we were chatting among some of us before we came on the stage, and I was saying, well, it's a little bit like an investor who's buying stocks. You know, the wise investor, I'm not an investor, so this is just hearsay for me, but, you know, a wise investor is spreading his or her money across a number of different stocks, so that if a couple of them flounder, well, they're still afloat elsewhere. Well, I think similarly, you want to invest in small organizations, grassroots organizations, giving women a voice in their communities, youth as well. And some of them, they may not end up succeeding, but most of them will. And this is one role that the Peacebuilding Fund definitely plays in terms of supporting peace building across the world. we are a risk-tolerant fund, and we try to fund early and upfront so that it will be, let's say, easier for others to follow after that. So, and I think this is part of what we understand now as the relationship we're trying to build. Before we were talking a lot about donor and client, but now we're talking a lot more about partnership. So if you're really building a partnership, it has to look differently. I think it has to feel differently, and then you need, you need the proper tools. And I'm sure we'll talk quite a bit more about the tools in a moment. But maybe just to finish for the moment, in terms of what are the reforms or the actions that need to happen. Well, let me state the obvious. I think, again, the donors or the partners need to be ready to fund some of these small organizations directly. And what I would frankly like to see is that the funds with significant resources would consider also allocating or putting aside a certain percentage of their resources that go directly to these smaller groups, so that you have a minimum threshold of resources that is going to this small but very important constituency. And then you can build in things to support them, like capacity building and perhaps more flexible reporting arrangements, and hopefully longer term support as well. I would also like to see climate finance have a strong gender marker throughout. There was a mention by Oyun of clear metrics and indicators for impact. Well, if we have that clear gender marker, both in terms of conflict sensitivity, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries, and a gender marker, then I think we're going to get to the type of inclusive, impactful, and sustainable approach to climate security. And in the cases where, well, let me put two more points out really quickly. Part of the conundrum of a lot of small organizations is that funders come to fund an activity. They fund a project which has a beginning and an end. And they're often very loath to put in core funding or funding for capacity building. And many of these organizations are already working on a shoestring. If you expect them to carry through an ambitious initiative on the ground, you can't expect them to do it with that same minuscule capacity and with very little overhead, if anything, to carry it through. So that absolutely has to be built in. And finally, with the small grassroots groups, if it really is very difficult for funders to fund them directly because they don't have the full capacity for all of the reporting that they require, there's always a possibility of going through intermediary organizations, either networks or coalitions of NGOs in their community or in their country, that can give them that extra support and in a way be their kind of guarantors, but with a clear idea of what is the mutual accountability, where is the ownership, and what is the visibility for each of the actors. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. There were a lot of good recommendations in there, not least for not just funding projects and initiatives, but core funding for organizations, whether it's for sort of running costs of overheads, but also then capacity building long term to invest in the organizations that can then continue that work that you're funding through projects in the long run. So in that sense, it's seen as a really useful investment, even though I'm not an investor myself either. But it makes a lot of sense to me. Mary, when you hear these ideas, does that match your perception of the needs from the ground, so to speak?
Yes and no. I need to be saying that as a women's network organization, we are really positioning ourselves to be the institution that remains the eye of other grassroots community members that are part of the entire Rwanda Women's Network. In trying to do that, we have to make sure that we position ourselves as a women's movement that has capacity, that has got institutional strength, that is able to bring a capacity to the other masses of women in our communities. Here we are talking at women change makers. And if we have to build a network of women change makers. That's why we are calling for flexibility in funding so that we are able to manage and run our own community fund that allows us to also have a possibility to bring those women on board and making them also feel ownership of what they are doing in the communities. Because at the end of the day, we want to see a transformed women's groups that are going to vie for offices, that are going to vie for political agendas, that are women who are going to be into a constituency of networking as women facilitators in their own communities so that they can bring change that we are talking about in our countries. And to be able to do that, you really must have to be a solid network organization. So build our capacity to be able to bring the ownership to the very right women who are part and parcel of us. And I think this is what networks like Kvinna, and many others are trying to do so that we make sure that we multiply the effects and the impact and the change around gender-based violence, around the climate crisis issues, and also around changing laws, inheritance property rights issues, land issues, because the way we are organized in our spaces, we are talking about holistic interventions that really allow us to be the change makers that we want to be in years to come. So for organizations that support us, you will always be proud to come back in 20 years, 10 years, and find that such organization you have supported are there, and that's what will show you the impact of the work that we have done. So let's work towards building the capacity of grassroots national women's organizations that are trying to multiply to bring efforts of change at the local communities. So that fund, to allow us to document even our processes, to allow us to advocate and bring the national conversation the way we want to bring them vis-a-vis closer to our leaderships are very key. And you cannot do that if you don't bring the masses of women on board. So this is what we would really urge for, and that's what we are looking forward to see. And so let's see how does this 3% climate financing, where are we with the Paris agreements? Because we hear Paris Agreement, we hear all sorts of different initiatives. Maybe in the open discussion, we'll be able to learn more so that we may also see how we can eventually tap in all those layers so that we have enough opportunity to bring the masses of our women community facilitators who are actually the change makers of our networks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that perspective. And you're highlighting that there's another level of bonus effect by doing this, and that is empowering women who can then make a difference at the national and international level in important positions if they have been, so if their capacity from the ground has been built in a sustainable way. Obviously, someone or a lot of people have made a lot of decisions that led to 97% of all the funding going to non-women's organizations, right? And that leads me to wonder who's doing that and what do they represent? What is the diversity on the donor side in terms of the decision-making procedures? I know in recruitment, for example, there's always a tendency towards a bias of self-recognition. Well, if a candidate looks like a 20-year younger version of myself, then obviously that's a brilliant person, right? And I'm wondering, do we have a similar problem when it comes to climate funding or to funding women's organizations on the ground working on these issues? I don't know, Oyun, if you would like to take a first stab at this, what the donor community looks like that makes these important decisions.
Well, maybe I can just speak on GCF's behalf. Of course, you know, as I mentioned before, all our projects have to be gender screened, gender filtered, and a number of quite a few projects, and I even know an example from my own country, Mongolia, receiving a project for SMEs, and it's not the conflict situation, but you know, there is a deliberate attempt to not only include women in the consultation when the projects are designed and originated in the country level, but also we deliberately encourage when the projects come in the pipeline that women are part not of the implementing organization, are part of the beneficiaries. Also, you know, that gender is fully mainstream. So to your question back, Mary, on the overall climate financing, of course, you know, although we have been replenished 3 years ago, and for 4-year programming period, it's about 10 billion, and Sweden is also one of the largest contributors as well. But if you look at 10 billion for 4 years, it's about 2.5 billion a year, which is 2.5% of 100 billion, which is promised. So although there is a huge expectation, and I can say for sure that the pipeline that come towards us from, now we work with more than 140 countries. We have, you know, projects in more than 140 countries, but the projects coming in the pipeline is very strong. We have more than 20 billion. If we look at the co-financing, almost $80 billion worth of requests in concept notes and expectations. So I think there is a major momentum being built in developing countries, and there is a major sort of political willing to leapfrog to greener, low and climate resilient development. It's also about availability of finance, and not talking on behalf of GCF, but talking on my personal capacity as a former member of parliament or minister in Mongolia, and I come from a developing country. I think my personal view is that we cannot just rely on a few developed countries to provide climate finance. You know, this Annex 1, which is 30 years old, from the early 1992. I think it has to be a global also funding as well that should be available, because now things and the dynamics have changed. You know, the big sort of a lot of major countries that maybe 30 years ago were not economically very rich, now they're becoming one of the top leading economies of the world. So I would say that, you know, it's a global challenge, and the solutions have to be also provided globally, including the finance as well. But just maybe I would like to add just one thing, that aid flows tend to halt during the conflict and slow to materialize in the post-conflict transitions, right? So that's why even this major challenge of conflict, climate change, the multiple crises, and that's why I think it's very important that the women's work on advocacy and service delivery in crisis responses, which is rarely leveraged or financially supported by national and international humanitarian actions, despite the evidence that they're often the only actors filling this role, as everybody was mentioning. I think it's important that deliberately to support the national and international efforts for women angles and women's dimensions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think both Petra and Elizabeth were participating in the high-level meeting in the UN General Assembly just a few weeks ago on peacebuilding financing. Are there some important lessons from that meeting that you could bring into this discussion? Elizabeth, you could take a first stab.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a few things. First of all, I want to very much agree with Oyun on this issue of, or her response, part of her response on what does the donor community look like. This is something that we've been talking about a lot. Also, within the UN and in the peacebuilding community, indeed we believe that we need to have a broader base of donors. The non-traditional donors, as she put it, many of whom perhaps a few decades ago did not have the level of resources they do now find themselves in a different position. And I think it would go a long way not only to have more funding, but more diversified funding that looks a little bit more like the people and the places that we're trying to support. That is really critically important. But secondly, you referred to the high-level meeting. So there was this high-level meeting at the United Nations recently that was organized by the President of the General Assembly on financing for peacebuilding, and ourselves at the Peacebuilding Support Office. We also organized some roundtables on financing for peacebuilding. And we had one specifically roundtable on local peace building. How do we support local peace builders more and more effectively? And some of the things I mentioned earlier had come up during the meeting, but I wanted to add a couple of other things that I think are critical, and that is not only who is funding, but how are the decisions made. And more organizations, I think, are rightfully clamoring for a seat at the decision-making table, so that they are consulted on where the money goes, what is it going to be doing, how exactly is it allocated and distributed, and so forth. They can also ensure that local voices are heard, make sure that whatever is being proposed in terms of climate security action is appropriate to that context, that local knowledge and experience is also brought in. So I think we need to have a much more participatory, let's say, funding landscape, and that can certainly be built in to funding decisions, even in large organizations. So we need to bring the, let's say, beneficiaries, if you will, who are not just beneficiaries. Again, they should be considered partners, and therefore they have a right, and in fact I think it's a necessity to be part of that decision-making process, also the monitoring of what ends up happening, and also helping to analyze the impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Petra?
Yeah, thank you. Well, ahead of the high-level meeting on financing for peace building, Kvinna to Kvinna Foundation, together with some other great organizations, provided a background paper for the meeting called Fund Us Like You Want Us to Win. And I think what's been clear here today is that the system today is not set up for women's organizations to win, rather the opposite. So then, so why is that? And I think, in my opinion, there are two elephants in the room. It's patriarchy and it's militarized security. And that the world somehow revolves around those two systems that are just there. And I mean, we talk about financing now for women's rights organization working on climate or peace building, but just a little parenthesis, looking at Sweden, who is on top of gender equal countries in the world, 1% of risk capital goes to female entrepreneurs. That's in one of the world's most gender equal countries. That's 1%. So, I mean, this is a problem that goes beyond how do we find funding for organizations in conflict-affected countries. And unless, I don't know if there's to my knowledge, there's no fora on how to dissolve patriarchy or how to deal with the fact that we go to militarized security and not look at all of the consequences that comes. You would have thought after COVID pandemic that we would have figured out as a world that human security is really what brings security to people. So, sorry, that's a little rant on two topics that I find really upsetting. But more concretely, and going back to risk, but also related, I think we need to have a whole new view on what's risk. When we talk about risk now, it's like the risk of losing money. And I would really like to shift the risk conversation from a donor agenda to a community agenda and talk about the risks that women human rights defenders, that climate rights defenders take every day. They are basically risking their lives in a context of shrinking democratic space that is spreading across the world. That is the risk that we should be talking about. We should not be talking about donors' risks of losing money, which, by the way, is a very, very small risk because the funding is really, really small. And even if we increase it, it's going to be a small risk. And what is that risk compared to all of these amazing human rights defenders that every day are risking their lives to make their societies better? I think that's really something we need to focus on. I'm done. Stop for now.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much. We're talking about the title of the panel is, a little stovepipe, funding women's organizations working on climate security, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, we are talking peace building, we're talking capacity building, empowering women. We're also talking about human security. So clearly there are enormous connections going on here. And I'd like to turn to you, Per, if you could perhaps address the interlinkages here and why these, when we talk about the specifics, yes, it's really important, but what's the grander scheme of things here?
I thought we were done now after Petra's intervention, because you sort of nailed it, I think, to what this is about. No, but I mean, yes, the headline of this panel is what it is, but I mean what our task is here is to embark from the local situation, from the context, and as we've heard, women or vulnerable groups, indigenous people who are working in those youth, who are working in those contexts, they make no difference in their hands-on, feet-to-the-ground work between what is a climate adaptation, what is an ecosystem restoration, what is a peace-building effort, because it is the same thing in people's lives. But the further up levels you go, we start building silos and we have our decision-making structures and so on. And as further up in the hierarchy we go, we formalize things. And as we formalize things, men take over. And that is, I mean, if you look at our experience as Folke Bernadotte Academy, who are sitting on the seats in the formal organizations and the formal negotiation or peace or mediation or constitution building processes, men. But who are in the seats in the informal networks and groups, in the informal dialogues, who are actually the resilience builders for these processes to happen or to be successful? Well, they are women, and they don't access what we have formalized. So I mean, it is a buzzword at this, but to break the silos, to find ways to overcome the formal barriers that we've built is one way of doing it. But that does also mean breaking the silos between what we've discussed now on gender equality, on climate, and on peace building. Gender equality is an objective by itself, but it's also the primary mean to reach any other objective in these nexuses. And I think the realization of that is extremely important. I mean, the Academy works on designing and facilitating inclusive peace processes or constitution building processes in conflict, post-conflict settings. And when you try to build inclusive processes and you clearly see that the people that need to be included are not resourced to be included. They're not. We haven't built the capacity to be included. They cannot be at the table, and we try to give the technical support. We've been successful a couple of times in Mali, for example, where there was a peace treaty signed without the involvement of women. We have, together with the UN, been able to give support enough for women to organize themselves, to capacitate, to build the needed, to equip themselves with the tools. These women are now at the table in this ongoing peace process. They're now included in the peace process. They were not before. So you can come quite far with the technical track. You can do so. And when the world is now busy discussing the backlash on women's rights, the backlash on democratization, on shrinking space, the backlash on human security perspective, the backlash on climate, we have to now grab the potential in the technical track, because we can still, on an operative level, move things forward as we're trying to avoid to move backwards on a policy level. And when we do so, I think there's going to be opportunities to actually build inclusive processes. But again, the access to that financing, not very big, we've heard, but that it makes so much difference, that the technical support can reach an organization or a group who actually have the resources enough to receive it and to use it. And we need to do so. Both the climate track is underfunded globally. The peace-building track is underfunded globally. Women are underfunded globally. If we cannot afford not to merge the potential here, because that is a risk that we're taking. I completely agree with Petra. The big risk here is not doing it. Look what we spend on the consequences of climate change. We have developing countries spending 40% of their GDP on climate adaptation. If we don't use that climate adaptation programming as conflict prevention, we're losing the potential. And if we're not letting women also lead those processes, we're losing potential. So, I mean, I do hope, I have a lot of hope in the technical track. Maybe because I just left the policy track and stepped into the technical track, I don't know. But there's a lot of talking, right? And we come together in forums and conferences and we say very much the same thing. Then we don't see the results of that. So you know, let's get our hands together and move things, because if we do, if we're determined, then we can. Yeah.
Thank you. My list of questions is very long, but it's really time to add the expertise and the perspective from the audience, both here in the room and at home. So if we can start moving microphones around, I would just like to make a little reflection regarding the importance of the concept of human security in relation to what we are talking about, because that by definition is a context-specific perspective. It is a bottom-up capacity building and an empowerment perspective. I've always heard that, you know, when you give the local communities the power to define what challenges they want to work on, that there's a risk. Well, what if they work on the wrong things? And obviously, it's only an armchair strategist in the capitals of the northern world who can say that people on the ground are working on the wrong things. But what we've also found, for example, I've worked in the Eastern DRC with women's groups, is that they tend to think more about the right things in terms of long-term sustainability of societies. They talked, when we expected them to talk just about sexual violence and ending the conflict and what have you, they talked about education and land rights. They're addressing the real issues of that society. They're also talking about environmental issues, climate change. So if you ask the local community, they will direct funding and resources towards what is really important to them. But that is also quite often what is really important to the global community. So we should never it's again, when we talk about risk-taking, well, what if they choose the wrong things to work on? Well, they're not going to do that. That's an incredibly low risk, rather the opposite, that we armchair strategists who think we know better, we are the ones who might be very wrong in what the local communities need and where we should direct our resources. We have some questions in the room, I saw that. And please introduce yourselves and keep the questions brief.
Let's mix or take a few questions that the panel then can address together. And I also would like to mix online audience questions with in-person questions. Let me start with an online question. There are major information asymmetries. Multilaterals may not be the best equipped to identify local partners and may set very high standards to directly channel funds. How can the multilaterals approach these problems in a more structured and systematic way? First question. Second question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Turki Al Mahmoud. I'm from the state of Qatar. My questions to your panelists and especially to Elizabeth regarding one of the main barriers is the building the trust. Have you ever thought of using role models or successful stories to gain more trust and build a better reputation regarding the women leaderships? The second question is also was by the panelist is related to the intangible incomes, as financials always look into numbers or tangible incomes. How to more focus or build more intangible incomes that can overcome the lose in numbers, and in which we can convince the vendors, the donors or the investors to invest more related to the women's climate security actions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's take one more. Somebody over here? Yes.
Hi, thank you. I guess I'm just wondering, we hear a lot about how much Sweden is really standing out in terms of its funding and taking on more of the risk, or recognizing the communities that are the one taking that risk. So what is Sweden doing to help diversify from the international donors or convince international donors to also join them in this step?
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have a lot to chew on with that first round of questions. So let's start with the multilateralism and challenges related to that. Elizabeth, would you like to start?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, certainly I liked your analogy about the sort of the armchair decisions and so on. And I have to say, you know, having worked in the field and then also working at headquarters, New York City is an awfully long way from many of the countries where we do most of our, I think, very important work. And yes, one could argue that multilateral organizations are not the best ones to, as it was said, sort of identify partners or work with local communities on the ground. But they can be, and we can be, because we do have quite an important presence across the world of our local UN staff, the resident coordinators of our offices in all over the world, the UN country teams, others. If they're doing their job properly, they are well connected with the various communities, and they can identify at least, you know, some of the larger groups who then can take us, as Mary was saying, to the grassroots groups and so forth. And I would simply say, where there's a will, there's a way. And if the UN and other multilaterals are doing their job properly, they are plugged in to those networks and those communities. If they are not, then frankly, maybe they should get another job. And then just on the issue of building trust and whether we have or we could showcase role models or success stories, absolutely. I mean, I often gripe about the fact that I don't think we're communicating well enough or successfully enough the good work that is being done with our support, and that's something that I hope we can do better in future. And indeed, I think it's very important that we highlight the successful trajectories of the groups and the communities that we support. We need to get better at that as well. Thank you.
Petra, I think Kvinna to Kvinna, the whole idea is to be that partner that builds capacity but that understands the multilateral community. Could you elaborate on these issues as well, because you're working with precisely these things that we are talking about right now.
Yeah, well, I think, as you're saying, in theory, a lot of multilateral organizations, you know, that's how it should work. But, you know, the world doesn't always function the way that we thought. So I think that there are, of course, a number of program countries where Kvinna to Kvinna supports organization where that connection isn't really working. And I think, you know, we all have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and some of us should, you know, use the 2 ears more and listen. And I really think that is the issue of the multilaterals in country, as this in the same way as it is for Kvinna to Kvinna, as an international organization working with our partners. We are there and we need to listen. We are there to support. We do not have the solutions, as you just said. But I don't know, Mary, if you have, what is your experience of working with multilaterals?
Yeah, I think our experience, again, I would want to assume how it works in Rwanda might not work in the other countries. Rwanda is very forceful when it comes to around partnerships with the local organizations. Increasingly, we are seeing some positive change whereby we see UN, like UN Women, even UNDP, closely trying to link themselves with the work we do, which I think to a certain extent could be coming a message that's clearly coming from the government. So in other words, there is a lot of interest in promoting tripartite partnerships around local organizations and the UN system, and we have seen increasingly being invited to serve on the UN boards, like civil society serving on the UN Women's Board, and also, you know, government now pushing for civil society or even international partners serving even on the joint development action forums, which are found at the district level. So all this, again, it's happenings that are coming from different governments, initiatives, to make sure that international organizations, local organizations, and government have somehow a platform where they meet at the district level to be able to harmonize the implementation at the implementation level. So it's a move, it's a new move, and I think this is coming out of Rwanda's initiative to make sure that there is a coordination. That coordination that gives the impact and the results at the end of the day at our implementation level. So this is a great move. I'm not sure whether the same happens in the other same countries, but in Rwanda there is that shift that is happening slowly, but it's coming, and we are seeing ourselves really beginning to dialogue with World Vision, with big NGOs at the decentralized level, and the government also seated to make sure that there is no duplication at the district level. It's a new move, but it's slowly coming on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat?
I just wanted to say that I think also looking a few years back, to just commend the UN family for what they have actually been able to move on in these issues. We see a much more united UN family. We see much more united country teams. We see much more value-based interventions where gender equality and women's participations are much higher on the agenda, and it's also being looked at and followed up. There are actors that could be in this panel next year from the development banks, from the international financial institutions, and then we talk about money flows. I mean, the UN does not have near the money that these actors have. But how do they make sure that their money comes to the local organizations, to the grassroots movements, to the women's networks? Because we have to unlock also those financing flows if we want to make it a real change here. Because if we unlock and change it through the UN and through some bilateral support and so on, that will still just be a little bit of the whole development system money that comes through the banks, for example. So we need to have them on board. I just wanted to respond to one question which I can try to answer leaning more on my previous capacity, but Sweden's been instrumental in trying to push for an agenda that we call good peacebuilding financing, which is about making sure that donor countries provide the funding as they should. The case for core funding is evident, for example, but also that we make sure that the funding processes are inclusive, so that not the recipients, as you say, but the agents of change that we need to resource are part of the discussion on how that resourcing should be made. So trying to gather countries, as very often in the UN system, you start with the like-minded, but the necessity, especially in our world today, to go beyond the like-minded groups is definitely there. And speaking on Qatar, who is also a growing and important donor in the world today, of course, we have traditions of using different tracks and channels to channel that flow. But increasingly, I think also there is a potential for traditional, non-traditional donors, as we say. It's not maybe the accurate way of putting it anymore, but to get together and target our financing the same way, so that we make sure that we map and reach the groups that need this financing. They're good. If I just 2 minutes, they're very good examples from how UNDP developed cash support to reach women through their cell phones without having to go through the male head of the family, for example, and what difference that makes in families, what resilience that builds in communities, which are important then bricks in making sure we have a human security perspective and therefore preconditions for sustaining peace. There are microfinancing experiences where you can target and count on the risk, right, on targeting women entrepreneurs, and then you see the same thing. So we have also through technology and these things so much potential, and we know how to do it. So it is really much, I think, to put trust in that very operative segment, and let's not waste so much more time, I think, in pushing policy all the time. Let's just push the world instead.
Should we grab another couple of questions? We're quickly running out of time here, but...
Are there any more questions from the audience? I have one online here. If you finance local women's groups through intermediaries, how can you ensure the gradual transfer of resources and responsibilities to local women's group over time as they grow institutionally stronger?
It's a good question. Let's start there, and I'd like to direct that one towards Oyun first, who didn't get a chance in the last round, because this is obviously something you work on, and I guess bringing you into the former discussion on how we can assure that the local groups are funded and capacity built, but also then the challenge of working through intermediaries, or is that a challenge, or is it perhaps a force multiplier when you do that?
Yes, no, very important. So I would like to give a concrete example of how at the fund here we're trying to work directly with the local actors. We have a modality, of course, we work through, GCF is basically a partnership organization. We work with and through partners, what we call accredited entities. And then accredited entities can be UNDP, UN organizations, but also multilateral developments of the world, but more than 50% of our accredited entities are what's called direct access entities. Basically, local financial institutions, some are government organizations, some are even civil society organizations. So it's a very innovative new model. And our board, funders, basically there's a clear mandate from the board, please focus more and support more direct access entities. So we have more than 100 accredited entities. As I mentioned, more than 50 of them are direct access. For example, in Rwanda, it will be a government organization, Ministry of Environment. So our funding, if it comes directly from Ministry of Environment of Rwanda, doesn't have to go through the UN or MDB or African Development Bank, for example, right? So I think this is very, very important. But in order to do that, very important also capacity building, how to access the finance, right? How to put the project proposals. So again, in order to do that, we have a grant window called Readiness, which will support capacity building, planning, including adaptation, for example, but also project preparedness facilities. So we provide grants so that the local and then not only to government organizations, but private sector, civil society organizations that are our accredited entities, they will be given grants to actually put together project proposals that come our way as well for the board to be approved. So I think this is very, very important practice that should be also expanded. But to your question on intermediaries, so again, the international organizations that access our funding and implement in those countries, of course, as I probably mentioned earlier, I just would like to come back to this metrics, clear metrics and indicators that are essential. How do we measure that as part of this results management framework, and to include the indicators that allow better measure impacts on peace, on security, on gender, on local communities. So I think, the devil is in details, right? And then I used to be also member of parliament, so it's not that difficult to put different policies together, but I think a lot of people just, don't go into nitty-gritties of indicators and measurements and verification. And then I think that's where the results on the ground actually become very tangible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think on a personal note, when we talk about climate change and other large issues like geopolitics and security, radicalization and terror, what have you, we rightfully acknowledge that these are global challenges that require global solutions. And we say that a lot. But at the same time, we have to break down those global challenges and solutions to something tangible. Or there's a I believe, a great loss of agency, because who am I, little I, to tackle this global challenge of climate change? But we can actually, all of us, work at the local level addressing these issues if we think smartly about these things. But that means we have to somehow address these challenges of the international, the national, the local level, and making sure that we empower those who have the smartest solutions to these challenges. Thanks for that great discussion. And unfortunately, there's a huge clock in front of me, and I'm really stressed out. But I would really like for all of the panelists to look forward into the future and give us a few recommendations. And we have to share that little time evenly. But where do we go from here? What good practice do we continue, and what do we change now? And let's do it in the original order again. Then, so Per, you can start.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I think what we need to understand is that climate change, armed conflict, gender inequalities are mutually reinforcing crises for us. And we have to tackle them as mutually reinforcing solutions. And to be able to do so, I think, Robert, you were the one, but from a bottom-up approach, because at the bottom, if you allow me to say like that, things are as interlinked and mutually reinforcing already. So with that perspective, that shift of perspective, we need to start there. Then I think, and that worries me a lot, is that we're moving into a sort of a global stalemate with the geopolitical sort of tensions and borders that are now revealed in front of us. And I'm saying that it's revealed because I'm not sure that we are now seeing a new world order shaping. I think we've had it for a while, but we just didn't want to see it. But it's there now. We will see a Security Council that cannot act. We unfortunately see the breakdown of the Organization of Security in Europe, OSCE. But that must not let us stop us. I have to quit. I know. I'm also seeing the clock. But through focusing on our operative level, we can continue to push these agendas, even though we have a political stalemate in the world. So that's my second message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra.
Okay, I'll be quick. There's been a lot of talk about we during these days as a collective we, and I think, and myself included, as a representative of an international NGO based in Sweden, that we need to be more honest and frank about the power structures among us as partners in this room. And some actors are more responsible for the current climate crisis than others, and that responsibility comes with power. So I think power is the topic of the conversation. And another thing that has come up over and over again during these days is trust. It's been in this panel, it's been before. There's a trust deficit of leaders that exist in the world, young people, people in general. They don't really trust multilateral systems and politicians. And I think what you just said, Robert, that we can all do something as individual, but for that to feel meaningful, there needs to be trust that someone else on a systematic level is doing something else. So how can we work on that, building that trust? And finally, I find it extremely upsetting that women's rights organizations, youth organization working for indigenous rights, consisting of people who pretty much are innocent of causing this global climate crisis that we're in. They now have to suffer the consequences, and they also have to mitigate the risk of these global crises, and they don't get the funding to do it. So I guess my recommendation is a shift of power, and if that happens to happen through a feminist revolution, then I will definitely consider joining that.
Thank you, Petra. Mary?
Yeah, mine is to really continue to push for a community fund that is going to allow us to continue engaging meaningfully. And beyond that, I would also like to see the continuity of our conversation around community risks. And thank you for bringing up this. I do believe that if we continue to discuss about community risks, are going to continue to keep us connected. as people who believe in change, working towards the transformation, and continue to take our advocacy agenda to the next levels. So community risk issues is very important that we continue to discuss them as we continue to advocate for change. And lastly, of course, as someone at the bottom of the pyramid, I would like to make sure that we continue to document our issues, we continue to document our success stories to keep guiding you in your future engagement with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Oyun.
Yeah, no, I think we all realize that the challenges we are facing are very complex in nature. And then we also, of course, understand, especially the nexus and the integrated nature of the solutions that we have to come up with. And because it's so overwhelming and complex, I think we also have to try very hard in all our works to try to find the leverage points, right? Yeah. Find the right places to intervene. Because we can have 100 solutions, but which are the 3-4 solutions that will bring the biggest, what's it called, bang for the buck or so? Or basically, which will bring the biggest result for a smaller volume of money or funding, for example. So I think that's very important for us always to keep in mind that we have to look for the right places to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Elizabeth.
Yeah, well, it's always great to go last because all of your points have been taken. So I wanted to say that I think Per in particular stole my talking points, but I did want to just quickly reinforce a little bit what he was saying. And that is that we've talked quite a bit about, let's say, the need to work horizontally across the different key areas. Peace, climate change, development, gender, and so forth. Extremely important. That's how you build and sustain peace. That is how you also work to save the planet. But we also have to work vertically, and all of the levels, I think, are really important. And I couldn't agree with Per more in terms of, let's say, the multilateral level. I think multilateralism right now is under severe strain. At the same time that we need it more than ever. And we need to see how we're going to rebuild that and how we're going to rebuild the solidarity that's absolutely critical, because it's obvious, as also you so well said, dear moderator, that we have to work locally, but also there are things that have to happen at the top level, and we need to see how we can do that. I think it's going to be a challenge in the coming years, but. Basically, none of the things that we've discussed at the end of the day, particularly the issue of climate change and climate security, can be solved by any one actor alone. So we need to realize that all those levels need to work. So both horizontally, what needs to be holistically worked on in terms of peace, development, security, climate, but also vertically, we need all of those levels to kick in as optimally as possible. Then just a word on the issue of inclusion, which is so important in these processes. We've talked a lot about women's organizations, but Petra, you also mentioned youth, and I think the Women, Peace and Security agenda is far from being where we want it to be in terms of impact, but we have made some progress. I think the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, if you will, and the Youth Climate agenda is also begging for our attention. And when we look at most of these fragile and conflict-affected countries where we're trying to support on climate security, the vast majority of the population are very young people, and they need absolutely to be engaged, and we need to support them as well. And finally, I just wanted to end with the point that you made earlier, Per, about the fact that we have technical solutions. I mean, let's be clear. Petra's organization has put out a great report. We have experiences that we've learned from. There's a lot of wisdom on what we need to do to support these women's organizations who are on the front lines of climate security action. So we have that wisdom and knowledge. Now we simply need to apply it. So it's really a question of political will, as always, and that's linked again to the power structures. We have the knowledge, we have the ideas. Now we just need to have the courage to apply them. Thank you.
Thank you. And those are excellent final words. We have talked about issues of great complexity that might sound daunting, but let's just also acknowledge the fact that the civil society groups, the women's organizations on the ground, they are not discouraged. They are fighting every day to improve their livelihoods, but they need access to funds. And that's why I'm so grateful that you took the time, all of you, to discuss these important issues so that we can make their work a little easier and to strengthen their capacity and to build a better future. These conversations will continue in the afternoon. There's two sessions on peace building and funding for those activities. So I encourage you to continue this discussion with us. Thank you, all of you, also for participating at home and here in the audience. Thank you again.